December 8, 1941. The Pacific wind cuts cold through the wreckage near Niihau Island. A young Japanese pilot, Shigenori Nishikaichi, drags himself from the twisted remains of his Zero fighter. Oil stains his uniform. His breathing is sharp, uneven. He expects a bullet. Instead, he hears English words: calm, firm, not hateful. American locals, still stunned by the attack on Pearl Harbor just hours earlier, move toward him. Their faces are tense, their hands shaking. But they do not strike. They bandage his arm, offer him water. The pilot stares in silence, confused. He had been told Americans were monsters, ruthless and cruel. But what he sees in that moment shatters everything he believed about his enemy. War has begun, yet something unexpected survives within it: mercy. In the days after Pearl Harbor, the Pacific was chaos. Smoke still rose over the wrecks at Battleship Row. The United States had been struck without warning, and the shock cut deep. Newspapers screamed for revenge. Politicians promised justice. Across the country, anger turned into action. Recruiting stations overflowed, and factories shifted overnight into war production. But beyond the headlines, another reality was unfolding. The first Japanese prisoners of war were being captured. Some were airmen shot down over Hawaii. Others were sailors pulled from burning wreckage near Wake Island or Guam. Most believed they would be executed on sight. Their training and propaganda told them Americans were brutal, that capture meant dishonor and death. The U.S. military faced a dilemma. They had never fought an enemy quite like Imperial Japan. Fanaticism, obedience, and Bushido honor shaped every Japanese soldier. To them, surrender was shameful. Dying for the emperor was sacred. The idea of being taken alive was unbearable. American forces, however, were bound by a different code. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required humane treatment of prisoners. The United States had signed it. Japan had not. This single difference created an odd contrast. A nation burning with fury, yet legally and morally committed to restraint. Still, in December 1941, emotions ran high. Pearl Harbor's destruction was personal. Thousands were dead or wounded. Every Japanese face was seen as the enemy. On the ground, soldiers and civilians alike wrestled with rage. Commanders had to enforce discipline, reminding troops that vengeance could not guide military conduct. In the Pacific Theater, the first captured Japanese were treated with medical care, food, and shelter. Interrogations began immediately, but they were quiet, procedural, almost sterile. The Japanese, trained to expect torture, stayed silent or attempted suicide. Many refused food, believing death was preferable to dishonor. American doctors were bewildered by their behavior. Reports from naval hospitals described prisoners who bowed deeply before refusing treatment, expecting execution. Yet the guards remained calm. They followed orders. They spoke with respect, sometimes even curiosity. Slowly, word spread among Japanese survivors. Americans did not kill prisoners. They followed rules. This simple fact started to ripple through the war. It challenged everything imperial propaganda had told Japanese soldiers. If the enemy was capable of mercy, what else had they lied about? In those early months, both sides were still trying to understand the other. The Pacific War was not only fought with bombs and bullets, it was fought in the mind. And, for the Japanese, the first real shock of battle was not defeat, but compassion. This uneasy balance of hatred and humanity would soon shape the course of captivity across the Pacific. By early 1942, the United States was deep into war production. Troop transports, aircraft carriers, and munitions factories ran non-stop. The attack on Pearl Harbor had turned a divided nation into a machine of purpose. But even as the U.S. expanded across the Pacific, a quiet moral test began: how to treat a defeated enemy who had shown no mercy. Japan had never signed the Geneva Convention. For them, capture was not an honorable outcome. Soldiers were trained that surrender disgraced their family and the emperor. In Japanese military culture, a prisoner ceased to be human. They were erased, forgotten. This mindset led to horrific treatment of Allied POWs later in the war. Beheadings, starvation, and forced labor were common. The United States, however, approached war differently. The rules of engagement and international law demanded humanity, even toward those who had attacked them. The War Department distributed guidelines reminding officers that prisoners were to be protected, fed, and recorded. Mistreatment was forbidden. Every camp had medical inspections, religious access, and correspondence rights. It was not mercy out of weakness, but duty by design. American intelligence soon discovered that kindness could be strategic. Japanese POWs, isolated and confused, responded to humane treatment more effectively than coercion. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, guards noted that small acts, food, cigarettes, and basic respect, broke through silence. Prisoners began speaking about their units, training, and morale. It was psychological warfare without brutality. Yet beneath this discipline, tension still ran deep. Many guards had lost friends at Pearl Harbor or the Philippines. They had seen photos of massacres and bombings. Every time they handed a meal to a Japanese prisoner, they had to suppress anger. For the prisoners, every act of kindness felt unreal. They wrote in secret diaries about being treated as men, not beasts. Some wept. Others refused to believe it was genuine, certain the Americans were staging a deception before execution. Cultural misunderstanding magnified everything. The Japanese expected contempt but met professionalism. The Americans expected defiance but met silence. Over time, curiosity replaced fear. Prisoners studied English. They cleaned their barracks with precision. They bowed to guards out of habit, not submission. A strange respect grew. Cautious. Fragile. But real. As word spread back to Japan through Red Cross channels, families were stunned to hear their captured sons were alive, even healthy. Propaganda had promised they would be tortured or killed. Now, reports described them receiving medical care and letters from home. It was a small, silent contradiction in the empire's narrative. The stage was now set for a larger transformation, one that would unfold inside the American POW camps themselves. There, under watchtowers and barbed wire, something unexpected would emerge: understanding between sworn enemies. Human angle. For many Japanese prisoners, captivity was worse than death. They had failed their emperor and lost their honor. Some refused to give their names. Others sat in silence for days, refusing food. But when American guards offered blankets, cigarettes, or coffee, the silence began to break. One prisoner at Camp McCoy reportedly said, "Why do you feed me? I am your enemy." The guard answered simply, "Because you're human." That exchange captured the quiet shock spreading among the POWs. They expected hatred, not dignity. Slowly, they began to see the Americans not as demons, but as men. Psychological angle Japanese propaganda had portrayed America as a nation of cowards and criminals. Yet in captivity, the opposite appeared true. The discipline of American soldiers, the cleanliness of camps, and the fairness of treatment confused the prisoners. It clashed with everything they had been taught. Many experienced cognitive dissonance, the painful conflict between belief and reality. Psychologists later noted how this mental shock often led to cooperation. Prisoners began opening up, talking, even smiling. The war had stripped them of identity, but humanity was returning in the unlikeliest place: behind barbed wire. Military intelligence angle. The U.S. quickly learned that kindness was not only moral, it was useful. Harsh interrogation rarely worked with Japanese POWs. They would shut down or attempt suicide. But when treated well, some began to talk freely. At Camp Trinidad, Colorado, and Camp McCoy, officers found that casual conversation revealed troop movements, morale, and technical details. One pilot described aircraft fuel systems simply because an American mechanic asked politely about it. The War Department soon formalized this approach. Respect earns intelligence, one internal report noted. In a war of codes and secrets, empathy had become a weapon. Each encounter inside these camps carried emotional weight. Every small act of decency chipped away at decades of military conditioning. These prisoners began to see that strength was not cruelty, and that power could coexist with morality. Propaganda angle. The U.S. government recognized the quiet power of moral contrast. While Japanese broadcasts bragged about mistreating Allied prisoners, America wanted to show restraint. Photographs of clean, organized POW camps were circulated among Allied nations. Red Cross inspections were allowed freely. The message was clear. America fought fiercely but remained civilized. This approach also carried strategic weight. It weakened Japan's claims of moral superiority and sowed doubt among their troops. For every Japanese soldier who heard stories of kindness in American camps, the empire's propaganda lost strength. Moral angle. For American guards, duty and emotion often collided. Many had lost friends at Pearl Harbor, or seen footage from the Philippines. Standing face to face with the men responsible for such destruction was not easy. Some felt rage every time they looked at a Japanese prisoner's uniform. Yet, the U.S. command insisted on discipline. Guards were told that the strength of democracy was measured by its restraint. One officer wrote in his journal, "If I treat him cruelly, I become what I hate." This moral tension became part of the daily rhythm of the camps. Cultural angle. The deepest gap between captor and captive lay in worldview. To the Japanese, surrender meant shame beyond redemption. To Americans, surrender meant survival. The Bushido Code, shaped by centuries of samurai tradition, demanded loyalty until death. When captured soldiers received fair treatment instead of execution, many felt unworthy of it. Some begged to die. Others broke down when shown photos of their families, realizing they might one day see them again. For the Americans, this behavior seemed alien. But over time, they learned to interpret it, understanding that compassion, not dominance, earned respect by mid-war. These layers, human, psychological, military, moral, and cultural, had transformed the dynamic within the camps. What began as blind hatred slowly became reluctant respect. The war outside continued with full fury. Yet within the fences, a quiet revolution in understanding was taking place. This tension between vengeance and virtue would reach its most powerful moment when the POWs finally realized what America truly intended for them. By 1943, the network of Japanese POW camps across America had grown to thousands of captives. Camp McCoy in Wisconsin and Camp Trinidad in Colorado became central to the story. Both were built with strict order. Barbed wire fences, wooden barracks, and watchtowers rising above neat gravel paths. Yet inside those fences, life was nothing like the prisoners had imagined. The first shock came with the food. Japanese prisoners were given the same rations as American soldiers: meat, vegetables, bread, and coffee. The guards even allowed rice when it was available. One diary entry from a captured sailor read, "We are treated as though we were their own men." This cannot be real. Medical treatment followed the same pattern. Wounded prisoners were sent to military hospitals, treated by U.S. nurses, and given proper care. One pilot, whose burns covered half his body, was stunned when American surgeons saved his arm instead of amputating it. He asked through an interpreter why they bothered. The doctor replied, "Because that's what we do." That simple answer began to echo across the camp system. Rumors spread among the prisoners that Americans valued life, even an enemy's life. For men raised under a code that glorified death, it was incomprehensible. At Camp McCoy, an American officer named Colonel Zimmerman became known for his calm, professional attitude. He demanded that guards treat prisoners with respect and forbade insults or violence. He told his men, "We are not here to humiliate them. We are here to hold them." Under his command, discipline and empathy coexisted. One of the most remarkable changes came in behavior. The Japanese prisoners began to volunteer for camp duties. They built gardens, repaired fences, and even created a small orchestra using handmade instruments. Guards reported hearing Japanese folk songs drifting through the barracks at night. Soft, mournful, and strangely peaceful. For the prisoners, this was the moment everything changed. Their fear of execution faded. Their confusion deepened. They began asking questions about America, about freedom, about why the enemy they were taught to despise could act with such fairness. It was the first real turning point in their understanding. The same hands that had bombed their cities now offered them food and safety. The contradiction was too large to ignore. Inside those quiet camps, thousands of Japanese soldiers began to question what they truly believed about war, loyalty, and humanity. By late 1944, the war's momentum had shifted. Japan was retreating across the Pacific, but in America, the prisoners were experiencing a different kind of battle, one of the mind. Many of them had now lived in captivity for over a year. The initial fear was gone, replaced by curiosity. Guards noted that some prisoners began asking for English books. Others requested paper and pens to write letters home. The War Department allowed limited correspondence under censorship, and through those letters, a quiet revelation reached Japan. The Americans were not savages. At Camp Trinidad, U.S. officers ran what became known as the Reorientation Program. They played recordings of Roosevelt's speeches and showed newsreels of American cities untouched by war. Some prisoners laughed nervously, convinced it was propaganda. Others listened intently. One officer reported that a group of POWs asked if they could learn baseball, saying, "We wish to understand America." The guards taught them. By spring 1945, baseball games between prisoners and American soldiers were common. Photographs from those games, bat, glove, and laughter under a wide sky, showed something unthinkable only a few years earlier. The men who had once aimed guns at each other were now cheering across the same field. There were darker moments, too. Some Japanese prisoners still held tightly to Bushido ideals. They viewed this kindness as a trap meant to weaken their spirit. A few attempted suicide, unable to bear the shame of survival. Others turned on their fellow captives who began to sympathize with Americans. These internal clashes showed how deep the scars of ideology ran. Still, compassion continued to erode resistance. The U.S. interrogators, many trained in psychology, understood that humiliation bred silence, but empathy opened doors. They listened more than they questioned. In return, prisoners offered details about Japan's supply issues, aircraft production, and morale. It became one of the most effective intelligence operations of the Pacific War, all achieved without brutality. By mid-1945, the Japanese POW camps had become strange islands of peace within a world still burning. Reports from the Red Cross praised America's adherence to the Geneva Convention. Visiting officials described prisoners who were clean, well-fed, and disciplined. The greatest transformation, however, was invisible. Within those fences, many Japanese soldiers began to feel something they had never known before: equality. They were still prisoners, but for the first time they were treated as men, not tools of war. When news of Japan's surrender reached the camps in August 1945, silence filled the air. Some wept. Others bowed toward the rising sun, painted on scraps of cloth. But a few turned their eyes to the American flag flying above the camp. They had entered as enemies and were leaving as witnesses to a different kind of strength. One built not on fear, but on humanity. The war had ended, but its most powerful lesson was still unfolding inside the hearts of those who survived it. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the news swept through American POW camps like a slow wave. Guards read the announcement over loudspeakers. Many Japanese prisoners stood motionless, eyes fixed on the ground. Some broke into tears. Others refused to believe it. The empire that had once promised eternal victory was gone. In the weeks that followed, the camps entered a strange calm. Prisoners who had spent years under strict routine now faced uncertainty. They would soon be repatriated to a country they no longer recognized. Many feared shame and rejection upon return. In Japanese culture, surrender was dishonor, and captivity meant erasure. Some requested to stay in America rather than face disgrace at home. U.S. officials began preparing for repatriation under the supervision of the International Red Cross. Each prisoner was documented, medically examined, and given food and clothing for the journey. American officers insisted on order and dignity during the process. At Camp McCoy, guards lined up to shake hands with departing prisoners. Some exchanged photographs. A few even bowed to each other, a gesture of mutual respect that would have been unthinkable in 1941. The prisoners' testimonies later revealed deep conflict. They had been treated with fairness, even kindness, by the same nation they had attacked. Many spoke of confusion and guilt. Others described gratitude. "We came to kill them," one former airman said, "but they saved us." When these men returned to Japan, they carried stories that challenged everything their people had been taught. They spoke of Americans who obeyed rules, respected life, and showed mercy. These accounts spread quietly through post-war Japan, weakening the myth of Western barbarism that imperial propaganda had built for years. For U.S. authorities, this treatment was not only moral but strategic. It became a foundation for post-war diplomacy. Japanese POWs who experienced humane conditions were less hostile, more cooperative, and ultimately more open to the idea of rebuilding under American guidance. In a war defined by brutality, these camps stood out as places where the rules held firm. The kindness shown to Japanese prisoners became an early seed of trust in the future U.S.-Japan relationship. But the true impact of that humanity would only become clear years later, as the same soldiers who once wore the rising sun helped rebuild their nation under a new banner of peace. In the years after the war, the experiences of Japanese POWs in American hands became small but powerful stories within Japan's slow recovery. Most of these men returned quietly to civilian life, blending back into a country devastated by bombing, hunger, and loss. Yet, what they carried from captivity changed how many saw the enemy and themselves. Some former prisoners spoke publicly about their treatment. Their words were simple but striking. "The Americans treated us as human," one said during a 1947 interview. "They gave us food when they had little, and they never struck us." Another, a former naval officer, described how an American nurse held his hand while he recovered from burns. He said he had never felt compassion from an enemy before. These testimonies, printed in Japanese newspapers, began to shift public perception. The U.S. occupation authorities recognized this quiet influence. They encouraged cultural exchange, language education, and journalism that highlighted fairness and democracy. Former POWs were often invited to assist as translators and advisors. Some worked alongside Americans rebuilding infrastructure. Others became teachers, using their English skills learned in captivity to educate a new generation. By the early 1950s, a few of these former prisoners even visited the United States again, not as captives, but as guests. They met the guards who once watched them and thanked them for their humanity. These encounters, though small, reflected the larger transformation between two former enemies. Historians later called it the moral victory within the war. The United States had proven that discipline and compassion could coexist even in total conflict. Treating POWs humanely had not weakened its military. It had strengthened its moral authority. For Japan, those lessons cut deep. The very soldiers who had once seen mercy as weakness began to understand it as strength. When they told their families and communities about life in the camps, they described America not as a cruel conqueror, but as a nation that fought with conscience. Those stories became part of Japan's post-war reflection, the long process of understanding why it lost and how it could rebuild. In the ashes of defeat, the memory of kindness became a bridge. And through that bridge, two nations that had once sought each other's destruction began to move slowly toward friendship. War strips everything down to its core: fear, anger, survival. Yet even inside that darkness, moments of humanity can break through. The story of Japanese POWs in American custody after Pearl Harbor proves that. These men entered captivity expecting torture. Instead, they found order, food, and medical care. They found guards who obeyed rules and officers who believed mercy was part of duty. It confused them at first, then changed them. For many, it was the first time they saw strength not in violence, but in restraint. When they returned to Japan, they carried that experience like a quiet flame. They spoke of Americans who treated them fairly, of kindness shown when none was owed. That memory helped shape how post-war Japan saw the world, not through the lens of pride or vengeance, but understanding. History remembers the explosions, the battles, and the losses, but buried inside those larger events are smaller victories, moments when people refused to become what war demanded of them. The kindness shown to Japanese prisoners after Pearl Harbor did not end the war. It did something harder. It preserved humanity inside it. That is the real strength of a nation. Not only to win, but to remain human while fighting.